Exact detail about where that snow might fall is still somewhat uncertain. We will keep you posted.
The news has been non-stop recently. How do you keep track? Flip the Script brings celebrities and journalists together to help.
Absolutely wild.
There's no such thing as a stupid question. Plus fun and games and some...
That is disgusting.
Interesting...
Shocking.
...moments.
Say it as it is.
Flip the Script. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Got a story to tell?
What I'm going to try and do is go to schools and educate a lot of people about it.
Just because somebody's disabled doesn't mean they can't achieve something.
If you're aged 11 to 18, the BBC can help you tell your story.
This is the world we're being left, a world made of concrete.
Tell us your story idea. Enter now at bbc.co.uk/Young Reporter Competition.
Download the BBC News app now and get the latest headlines as they happen. Personalise your app to learn more about the stories you care about and watch BBC News live wherever you are. Stay up to date, whatever you're up to. Download the BBC News app.
Today at 1, more fallout from Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages on COVID. He says he's the victim of a massive betrayal. The messages released by the journalist Isabel Oakeshott show division within Cabinet over shutting schools in the pandemic. She says she's acted in the public interest.
This is about the millions of people, every one of us in this country, that were adversely affected by the catastrophic decisions to lock down this country repeatedly.
Also this lunchtime, Boris Johnson says he'll find it hard to support Rishi Sunak's new deal with the EU over Northern Ireland's post-Brexit trading arrangements. The final report into the Manchester Arena bombing will be published, focusing on whether the security services could have prevented the attack. A post-mortem examination is to be carried out on the body of a baby found by police in Woodland near Brighton.
So I decided to write a story called Bella's Adventure. I got one of the chocolate eggs and I threw it out the window.
And on World Book Day, the UK's biggest story writing competition for children is back on the BBC.
Coming up on the BBC News Channel, former England captain Michael Vaughan is appearing at the hearing into racist behaviour at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. It follows allegations by Azim Rafiq, which were made public in August 2020.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has described the leaking of thousands of his WhatsApp messages written during the height of the COVID pandemic as a massive betrayal and breach of trust. He says they were released in a biased account to suit an anti-lockdown agenda. But the journalist Isabel Oakeshott, who revealed the messages, insists she's acted in the public interest. They suggest Mr. Hancock pushed to close schools during the pandemic, while the Education Secretary at the time, Sir Gavin Williamson, wanted them to stay open. Our political correspondent Jonathan Blake has more from Westminster.
The impact of the pandemic on education.
We are keeping that mask on at all times during the day.
Pupils and teachers wearing masks, schools closed to limit the spread of COVID. Big decisions under new scrutiny. The journalist Isabel Oakeshott, a critic of lockdown measures, was given access to Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages to help him write his book. She's since passed them to the Daily Telegraph, breaking a legal agreement.
This is about the millions of people, every one of us in this country, that were adversely affected by the catastrophic decisions to lock down this country repeatedly, often on the flimsiest of evidence for political reasons.
Yet you helped Matt Hancock write a book justifying all those very
Why?
decisions.
Because I wanted to get to the truth of it.
Matt Hancock accused her of betrayal. In a statement, he said there is absolutely no public interest for this huge breach. All the materials for the book have already been made available to the inquiry, he said, which is the right and only place for everything to be considered properly and the right lessons to be learned. He added, as we've seen, releasing them in this way gives a partial, biased account to suit an anti-lockdown agenda. In late 2020, Sir Gavin Williamson, then Education Secretary, argued for schools in England to stay open. Mr Hancock had wanted them closed. An exchange appears to show him pursuing that approach. I want to find a way, Gavin having won the day, of actually preventing a policy car crash, he said, when the kids spread the disease in January, adding, for that we must now fight a rearguard action for a rational policy. Weeks later, the Prime Minister announced schools in England would close as part of a lockdown.
Day by day, new evidence was emerging as the scientists were learning about this virus, and from that new that experience and those lessons, we were then taking decisions about what to do in schools where, 8 million children were in very close quarters. But we did always want to do everything we could to keep schools open.
Right from the start, for me, it became clear that children's well-being just wasn't one of the high priority considerations here. But there hadn't been the remedial action put into schools to be able to mitigate any problem coming down the track.
Other messages appear to show Matt Hancock and Gavin Williamson discussing teachers' access to PPE. So Gavin said some will just want to say they can't, so they have an excuse to avoid having to teach. Later, Matt Hancock congratulated him on a cracking announcement on exams, adding what a bunch of absolute arses the teaching unions are. Sir Gavin Williamson has said in the earlier exchange he was responding regarding unions and has the utmost respect for teachers who work tirelessly to support students. Private discussions, now public, casting new light on decisions with huge consequences. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
Our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, joins me from our newsroom in Leeds. Branwen, what do these revelations tell us about the decision-making at a crucial time over whether or not schools should shut during the pandemic?
Well, Clive, it gives us a partial insight into the tussles within government, the disagreements between the Health Secretary and the Education Secretary, in particular leading up to what parents will remember as one of the most chaotic days of the pandemic in England, in which schools opened, primary schools opened on January the 4th, 2021, only for the Prime Minister to announce that evening that they would then be reclosing to all but key workers and vulnerable children. Now, of course, there are wider arguments about the rights and wrongs of lockdown. It's worth remembering that around 200 countries around the world partially or wholly closed their schools in that first year of the pandemic. So England and the rest of the UK were not alone in doing that, even though there were these disputes within government about the when and why. But we know that there's been a lasting legacy for children and that some of that lost learning is still playing out within England's schools.
Indeed. OK, Branwen, thank you. Branwen Jeffries there live at our studios in Leeds. Boris Johnson has raised concerns about Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, saying this is not about the UK taking back control. The former Prime Minister was speaking publicly for the first time about the Windsor Framework, Mr Sunak's new deal with the EU.
I'm going to find it very difficult to vote for something myself, something like this myself, because I believed that we should have done something different. No matter how much plaster came off the ceiling in Brussels. And I hope that it will work. And I also hope that if it doesn't work, we will have the guts to deploy that bill again.
Our chief political correspondent Nick Eardley is at Westminster. Nick, how much of a headache could this be for Rishi Sunak, with Boris Johnson saying he's minded not to support it?
Certainly won't be welcome, Clive, because Since Rishi Sunak unveiled that Windsor framework on Monday, there hasn't been much explicit opposition. Most people who may have been critical have been withholding their counsel. Well, Boris Johnson has broken that today by calling the deal a drag anchor, which would make it hard for the UK to diverge from European rules. It's pretty clear that he doesn't want to vote for it. He said that he'll find it very, very hard. Is it a game changer though? I'm not so sure actually, because a lot of Brexiteers who've made trouble for Prime Ministers in the past have actually signed up to this deal and think it's a good thing. The DUP seems to be pretty split on whether to accept it, but it's taking its time to look over it. This may give some other Tory Brexiteers the impetus they needed to come out and say they won't vote for it as well. But I still don't get the sense that there's a massive rebellion that would cause Rishi Sunak significant distress on this. I'm told the Prime Minister is currently back in Windsor. He's at an away day for Conservative MPs. One of his aides says very pointedly it's focused on party unity. He hasn't seen the speech.
OK. Nick, thank you for that. Nick Early there at Westminster. The third and final report into the Manchester Arena bombing will be published today. Its focus will be on the role of the security services, on whether the attack could have been prevented, and the radicalisation of the bomber Salman Abedi. 22 people died in the blast, which happened after a concert by the singer Ariana Grande in 2017. Our North of England correspondent Danny Savage is in Manchester for us this afternoon. Danny, a big day then for the relatives of those who died and those who survived the attack.
Yeah, Clive, I think 6 years on after the arena bombing, what we may find out this afternoon is whether or not, from the view of the security services, if it could have been prevented from happening altogether. We know that MI5 were aware of Salman al-Abedi before the bombing took place. He was a person of interest for some time, but he was then sort of relegated to a large list of individuals who were previous persons of interest, if you like, subjects of interest. And I think the issue that the families are going to have today is when Sir John Saunders, who is the chairman of the inquiry, who arrived here this morning to begin his final day, at 2 o'clock this afternoon, he will make a public statement about this third and final stage of the inquiry about the security services involvement with Salman Abedi. But much of the evidence he heard in relation to that was heard in secret for national security purposes and reasons. And the families didn't hear it at the time. The only people who did hear it were the people giving evidence, Sir John Saunders and some of the legal counsel. And he will also be bound by, like, the Official Secrets Act, if you like. There will be only so much he can say this afternoon about that. But what we do know about him is that he will go as far as he can and say as much as he can to help the families come to terms with what happened. And I think this afternoon we'll hear from Sir John Saunders at 2 o'clock, and then throughout the afternoon from families about whether their questions have been answered as to whether this was preventable from a security services point of view, Clive.
Yeah, very big day. OK, Danny, thank you for that. Danny Savage there in Manchester. Protesters have clashed with police in Athens during demonstrations against the operator of the passenger train that crashed on Tuesday. Officers used tear gas to disperse the crowds, who lit fires in the streets. At least 43 people died after the collision with a freight train near the town of Larissa. With the latest, here's our Europe correspondent Nick Beak.
The aftermath of Greece's worst ever rail disaster. A station master in a nearby city has now been charged with manslaughter by negligence. And already the country's Prime Minister says tragic human error was to blame. But that has sparked anger overnight, including in the capital Athens, because for years there have been warnings the rail network was not safe. This surgeon, who came out of retirement to help the injured, says the many young lives lost were the victims of systemic failings.
It's a disaster, it's a catastrophic thing. Families are crying tonight. Unfortunately, the majority of the wounded, of the lost people are young students. They left home happy after the long weekend to go for their studies, to see their relatives, and never reached their case.
This is one of the hospitals where survivors and the injured have been treated. It's also where some family members have been coming to give their DNA in the hope that maybe any sort of samples that are recovered from the scene today will be matched to their loved ones who are still missing.
The force of the explosions were captured on camera, 2 fireballs ripping through the carriages. Visiting the wreckage, Greece's transport minister became emotional as he talked about the country's failing train network and later resigned. It's not known exactly how many passengers are missing, but many families now face an agonising wait.
OK, let's join Nick now, who's in Larissa. Nick, a terrible situation, and one clearly that has caused a lot of anger for the people there.
Yeah, Clive, I think if yesterday was a day of shock, today is one of growing anger, and that's because so many people here in Greece are looking at the scene behind us and asking themselves, could it have been avoided, and pointing to lots of evidence to suggest it could. The carriage you see behind us, we think, is the 3rd carriage on its side, and you may be able to make out some of the emergency workers, members of the army, and also a crane and heavy machinery shifting some of the debris on that side. But if we look to our left, the horrific mangled heap there is what remains of the 1st and 2nd carriages, where that fire tore through. And the grim reality is it's going to take days, maybe weeks, of painstaking forensic work if they're going to identify the remains of any of the victims from that particular place. So there is work that continues here, but also this deep sense of anger, and that's really epitomised today, Clive, in the fact that rail workers are carrying out this industrial action. They're going on strike. They're saying the jobs they're doing on the network, they're simply not safe, and they want urgent action. Lots of people saying they have concerns that any sort of investigation the government carries out will not be one that's full or transparent.
OK, Nick, thank you for that. Nick Beat there, live in Larissa. A post-mortem examination is to be carried out on the body of a baby found by police searching for the missing child of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon. The remains were discovered in an area of woodland near Brighton, close to where the couple were detained on Monday. Our correspondent Duncan Kennedy joins me live from the scene now. Duncan, this is such a tragic case, but at some point we'll get confirmation on whether or not this is the child of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon.
You're absolutely right, Clive, and that may come today, it may not. It's been a very busy morning, certainly here for police in the aftermath of what's happened. Their cordon that they put in place here is much larger than it was yesterday to allow in more vehicles, allow in more of their personnel. And as you say, it comes after that discovery, that tragic discovery last night of a baby's remains in this area here behind me. That in turn came at the end of a dramatic 48-hour search for the baby involving some 200 police officers, drones, police dogs, and of course members of the local community. What will happen now is that post-mortem examination to try to discover the cause of death. At the same time, the 2 people involved, Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, are still being questioned by detectives. They were arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. Now, yesterday, the police told us that they have an extra 36 hours to question the couple. It's not clear when that 36 hours will run out. At the same time, the local community are coming together tonight. They're asking people to light candles and put them in their porches as a mark of what they say is their love and respect for this tragedy.
OK, Duncan, thank you. Duncan Kennedy there, live just outside Brighton. Some teachers in Wales and the south of England are on strike today in a long-running dispute over pay. It's the 3rd day of walkouts by NEU members. There was industrial action in northern England on Tuesday and the Midlands and the eastern regions yesterday. It is 17 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. And there's more fallout from Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages on shutting schools during the COVID pandemic. He says he's the victim of a massive betrayal. And still to come, the former England cricket captain Michael Vaughan is due to give evidence at the public hearing into allegations of racism in the sport.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, Britain's Charlotte Banks and Hugh Nightingale claim the nation's first ever world snowboard cross-mixed team gold medal after a stunning performance in Georgia.
The government plans to build additional free schools in England for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Now, the long-awaited Department for Education proposals aim to improve what it calls a postcode lottery, where the quality of services varies region by region. Charities say the system is in crisis, with children who need support facing long delays before getting any help. Here's our education correspondent, Elaine Dunkley.
Across the country, there are mainstream schools struggling to support children with special educational needs and disabilities.
What's the difference?
This is Leighton Primary in Blackpool. Here, there are more than 90 pupils with special educational needs.
Recruiting for specialist support assistants is incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging. Schools are struggling for resources, local authorities are certainly struggling for resources. The capacity in the system just isn't there.
This head is transforming an area within the school where children with special educational needs can be assessed and given individual support.
All the local specialist school provision is under huge amounts of pressure to accept increasing numbers of children. What we are planning to do is create a provision whereby we can support them in their learning in a separate environment but integrate them over time back into classroom.
And then you're on another journey then, aren't you?
For these parents, long waiting lists to get children diagnosed with special educational needs and finding the right support has pushed them to crisis.
I go to different services, I see different professionals, and every single time I have to explain and explain and explain.
I don't know where my children will be in years to come. I don't know what will be out there for them. We can fight as much as we can fight, but if there's nothing there to help, what are we fighting for?
Let's see if we can get it on from the same place.
14-year-old Macy is autistic, has ADHD and has struggled to cope in mainstream schools. She's been excluded numerous times and now attends school part-time.
I've never liked school. I just didn't fit in. I was out of school for months, so then when I've gone into a school, it's a bit like so many people just everywhere and like crowding me. On the first day I went there, it was a lot.
One foot in the stirrup. Beautifully done.
When Macy's not at school, she comes here to Heroes, an educational therapy centre in Oxfordshire. It's helped hundreds of children with special educational needs who are struggling in school.
School pay for me to come here, so they are helping. I think I've learned a lot more being here. We're still doing work.
From mainstream to specialist schools, there are calls for urgent funding and intervention to help support an increasing number of pupils. The government is promising more investment and specialist staff and admits that for too many, the system is broken.
Almost ended up in the worst of all worlds with a lot more money being spent, but the provision not being right. So a big part of the investment is building the capacity. I mean, £2.6 billion into building more places.
Good.
Making the right changes are crucial in transforming the lives of thousands of children and young people. For too many, it's been a fight to get the right support. Elaine Dunkley, BBC News.
The former England cricket captain Michael Vaughan is due to give evidence on the second day of the public hearing into allegations of racism made by the former Yorkshire player Azim Rafiq. Vaughan and 5 other of his former teammates are accused of using racially discriminatory language. Matt Graveling is at the inquiry in central London for us now. Matt, just refresh us again of what the allegations are in all of this.
Yes, just briefly, Clive, some people might find the language in my report slightly upsetting, but as you say, Michael Vaughan is one of 7 men, along with Yorkshire County Cricket Club, who have been charged with bringing the game into disrepute. Now, the former England captain is accused of using racist language towards former Yorkshire spinner Azim Rafiq and 3 other Asian players. Now, Vaughan is accused of saying, "There's too many of you lot, we need to have a word about that." Now, Vaughan categorically denies the allegation, and his lawyer said he couldn't quite believe that the claim had been made against him. His lawyer added that this happened before a T20 match all the way back on the 22nd of June 2009. And due to the passage of time that has passed, Mr. Vaughan can't quite remember what he said, but he's adamant that he did not use those words. One of the other players who claims to have heard the comments is the current England bowler Adil Rashid. Now, he's currently on tour with England in Bangladesh, but he dialed into the hearing via a video link. He said he was not offended He does not think Michael Vaughan is a racist, but that this was bad humour. Finally, Clive, the panel will also hear evidence relating to charges against 2 other former players today, Richard Pyra and Andrew Gale. However, they, like 6 of the other 7 men charged, won't be appearing here at the hearing, having withdrawn from the disciplinary proceedings. Clive.
OK. Matt, thank you. Matt Graveling there in central London. An inquest in Surrey has heard that the head teacher of Epsom College and her daughter, who were found dead at a property on school grounds last month, died of gunshot wounds. The bodies of Emma Pattison, who was 45, and her 7-year-old daughter Letty were discovered on February the 5th. Her husband George Pattison is believed to have shot them at their home before killing himself. The relatives of Joanna Simpson, the woman beaten to death by her estranged husband 13 years ago, have begun a campaign to prevent his early release from prison. Boris Johnson's wife, Carrie, has joined the effort, calling on the Justice Secretary to intervene to prevent Robert Brown's release later this year. Tim Muffet has that story.
Remembering Joanna Simpson. Westminster Chapel in London last night, where family, friends and campaigners gathered to honour her and to fight on her behalf. And to call for the man who killed her, her husband Robert Brown, not to be released from prison later this year, halfway through his 26-year jail term.
We're campaigning now to protect ourselves and the public, because with the sentence he has, Robert Brown will be automatically released in November. No application for parole, just out.
Robert Brown was a British Airways pilot. He'd driven to the home he'd previously shared with Joanna in Berkshire in October 2010. Armed with a claw hammer, he hit his wife around the head at least 14 times. Joanna had tried to defend herself. Their 2 children were in another room and heard the attack. Brown then buried his wife's body in a makeshift grave he had dug some weeks earlier. He was cleared of murder, but admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. At his trial, jurors heard that Brown had been consumed with anger throughout the marriage. The couple were in the middle of divorce proceedings. Robert Brown said he killed his wife during an argument about schools.
If he does come out, God help us, the revenge he will feel, because he feels he was stitched up by us, and we're worried. We're very worried.
The campaign to keep Robert Brown in prison is also backed by Carrie Johnson, whose speech last night was watched by her husband, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. She was targeted in 2007 by John Warboys, a taxi driver who was later convicted of rape and a series of sexual assaults.
I remember Hetty and Diana describing themselves as feeling like sitting ducks, powerless to do anything. And I knew that feeling from my own experience when I found out that taxicab rapist John Warboys was due to be released much earlier than we thought, with no explanation as to why. I remember feeling really scared. We think that the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, should urgently review this case and use all his powers to do what he can to prevent the early release of Robert Brown.
On Sunday, Dominic Raab said he would be taking a close look at the case and also agreed to meet Joanna's family.
My job is always to put victims first, so of course I'll meet with her, and secondly, to protect the public.
At the time of Robert Brown's sentencing, a prisoner in his situation could expect to serve half of their sentence before being released on licence. But since then, the rules have changed. For serious offences, prisoners now have to serve 2/3 of their sentence in custody. But that's still not long enough for many, including Joanna's mother, Diana. 13 years after her death, the family and friends of Joanna Simpson are still fighting on her behalf, and hoping that the man who killed her won't be released from prison this year. Tim Muffet, BBC News.
It's World Book Day, and the UK's biggest story writing competition for children is returning to the BBC. Camilla, the Queen Consort, who's hosted past grand finals of the 500 Words contest, described its return as a joy. The search begins for volunteer judges, as the BBC Breakfast John Kay now explains.
On my first day at school, do you know what I did? I kicked a nun. OK, so what I want to think about...
As stories go, it's quite an opening. But that's hardly surprising.
You made a mate. That's a really happy
Because
thing.
today's supply teacher is top children's author and 500 words judge, Frank Cottrell Boyce.
Everyone's got a story. Everyone can tell a story. We just talked today about, you know, what important days in your life, and every single one of them had a different story.
He tells the kids to let their imaginations run wild for 500 words.
I'm thinking of making like a story about an astronaut who really likes spaceships.
We are live at Hampton Court for the 500 words final! With a brilliant cover of Crazy Love.
It was the brainchild of Chris Evans, and more than 1 million stories were submitted in the first decade of the competition. As Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla was an honorary judge on 500 words. And now, as Queen Consort, she's supporting the competition again as it returns to the BBC.
The joy is that it's about to be relaunched. You know, you had this wonderful moment when you took them, you know, to the venue, the sort of surprise venue for the finals. Pride, you know, in these children's faces and the families and the schools.
The gold winning story, Snow Blood Window Frame by Eve Malloy.
I couldn't believe it. I thought they were joking.
4 years on, Eve tells me she's still in shock. Her fairy tale won hundreds of books for herself and for her school, but there was an even greater prize.
My confidence, it just went through the roof. Being in 500 words was the best thing that I've ever done.
Before any stories are written, 4,000 volunteer judges have to be recruited. Teachers, teaching assistants and librarians like Sarah, who did it last time and who's signing up again.
It's an amazing opportunity to really get insight into the minds of children, to have some really brilliant reading to do and to feel that they're playing a part in something that's a really powerful project that really makes a difference to children's lives.
This time, the competition is just for primary school children, and stories don't have to be submitted until the autumn, with the winners announced on World Book Day next March.
Words can be magic. You know, if you choose the right word, you can make people laugh, you can make people cry, you can start a fight, you can finish a fight, you can make people think, if you just choose the right word. Thank you so much.
John Kay, BBC News.
From words to music, because Eurovision tickets, they go on sale next week for 6 preview and 3 televised shows in Liverpool. Ticket prices start at £30 and will cost up to £380 for the grand final on the 13th of May. The event's being hosted in Liverpool after the UK was chosen for the competition on behalf of the 2022 winner, Ukraine. Fans will need to register for a Ticketmaster account ahead of the sale, going live from noon on Tuesday. Time for the weather. Here's Ben Rich. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Clive. Thank you. Good afternoon. Meteorologically speaking, winter is over. The numbers have been crunched, and what do we know? We know it was a dry winter. The brown areas on this chart show where it was drier than normal. Not good news, of course, after the droughts of last year. But across England and Wales, it was a particularly sunny winter. Not as much sunshine, though, for Northern Ireland or for Scotland. But if you thought we'd left winter behind, technically we have. Next week, you may well be doubting that because it is set to turn colder. Cold enough for some of us to see some snow. More on that in a moment. But back to the here and now. We've got a lot of cloud around. It is quite quiet out there, not moving very quickly as far as the weather goes this afternoon. A lot of cloud, some showers through Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England. Best of the sunshine through South Wales and into southern England. And temperatures about where they have been really through the week, 7 to 10 degrees. It is not particularly windy either. Now tonight we will see more cloud rolling its way westwards across England into East Wales, Northern Ireland and southern Scotland, staying pretty cloudy. There could be the odd light shower, but where we see some clear breaks, West Wales, the far southwest of England and also the northwest of Scotland. That's where we could see a touch of frost to start Friday morning, but it's also where we have the chance for some sunshine tomorrow. The best of that across northern and central parts of Scotland. Elsewhere, a lot of cloud for much of the time, maybe with the odd light shower. The Northern Isles will be showery and quite breezy. Temperatures again, 7, 8 or 9 degrees. Now, as we head into the weekend, colder air begins to seep slowly southwards behind this cold front here. Now, the front itself will be a very weak affair. It'll bring a band of cloud, a little bit of rain. This is Saturday's weather chart. Even further west, the cloud amounts will tend to increase as we go through the day. Temperatures maybe just showing signs of dropping away, particularly in the far north. And as we get into Sunday, that colder air continues to slowly work its way in. A few more of the showers on this chart will be wintry. The snow at this stage mostly over high ground, some more persistent rain into northern Scotland, and again those temperatures falling away just a little. But that cold air, having seeped slowly southwards, looks set to rush southwards as we go through next week. It will often be windy as well, which will only accentuate that chilly feel. There'll be quite a significant wind chill, and it will certainly be cold enough for some snow at times, but the detail of exactly where that snow will fall is still a little uncertain. We will keep you up to date. Clive.
Oh dear, be chilly. All right, thank you, Ben. Ben Richter. That's it. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good afternoon.